Topic Notes 3.2, Feeding Relationships. This gray angelfish looks like it's aiming towards my head as I was taking the picture, but of course it's not really interested in me. It's going to go after numerous little invertebrates and even some algae. It's very omnivorous. But of course today we're going to be talking all about feeding relationships. So let's get started. Main idea for today. Feeding relationships help define food webs as energy and biomass is transferred from one trophic level to the next. Ecosystems function through a sequence of energy transfers. And of course, you probably know this already, but energy, with very few exceptions, originates from the sun. That is what fuels life on this planet. Now, of course, what is that other exception? We'll get to that in a minute. How does this energy actually enter into the system? That is through what we call autotrophs. Now, autotrophs, meaning self-feeders, is simply another name for producers, or organisms that can capture the energy in light or chemicals, that exception we talked about, and use it to produce carbohydrates from simple molecules such as carbon dioxide. Now, as we mentioned, photosynthesis, which you've probably learned about before, is the key here, right? It only takes place in the ocean's upper layers, where about 90% of the marine life is found. And the majority of photosynthesizers in the open ocean will be phytoplankton, which is pictured up at the top there. Now, the chemosynthetic organisms are found near hydrothermal vents, which we've talked about a little earlier, and they exist in extreme conditions. And they take those chemicals and create carbohydrates and things like that from them. Now, here on the bottom left, you'll see the tube worms that exist around hydrothermal vents. And inside the tube worms are the bacteria, and you can see that on the right. And this particular bacteria oxidizes hydrogen gas. So there's different types of bacteria that do different things. Now let's get into heterotrophs, which are our consumers, which obtain energy and food through consuming autotrophs or other consumers. This includes all animals, fungi, and protozoans, and also most bacteria. Heterotrophs can be placed in various levels, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, essentially depending on what they eat, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. Now, there are various different types of consumers, and you've probably seen these words before. For example, a herbivore is an animal which feeds only on producers, plants, and phytoplankton. Over here on the right, you'll see a manatee munching on some seagrass, so that's a perfect example. Then, of course, we have carnivores, an animal which feeds on other animals. Great example of that would be the tiger shark on the bottom there. Now, when we call something a predator, it's an animal which hunts and kills and eats other animals. A prey would be an animal which is eaten by predators. And then, of course, we have omnivores, which sort of do a lot of things. It's an animal which feeds on other animals and on producers as well. Now, there are two other types of consumers we can look at. First of all, there are called detritivores. Now, detritivores consume non-living organic matter. They break it down internally and excrete the nutrients, which is really important to the environment. An example of this would be crabs, sea cucumbers, sea stars, things like that. Then we have decomposers. This would be your bacteria and fungi, which break down dead organic matter externally using enzymes and release the nutrients back into the environment. This is essentially the last stage in any feeding relationship, the decomposers. Now, predation is defined as the consumption of one species, the prey, by another, right? The predator. Now, predators can be secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumers. Predator-prey relationships may be an example of what we call coevolution, meaning that they evolve in response to each other. So they adapt based on each other's skills and ability to carry out the deed of either eating something or evading being eaten. Essentially, the evolutionary arms race. And this can include everything from planktonic little tiny animals all the way up to the leopard seal and the penguin you see on the right. Now, prey items, they don't exactly take things lying down. There's a lot of strategies they can employ. For example, they can have a lot of speed and agility like the sea lion does down there. They can also camouflage really well. They can coordinate in groups and school. You can see that really large school of fish. Schools of fish don't shoal like that unless, of course, they are working together to reduce the chance of being preyed upon. Plants actually have a various different defenses against herbivores, including chemical warfare and other internal structures that are not appetizing or non-digestive. Then we have defensive adaptations of animals such as toxins that they can have in their bodies, camouflage, mimicry, spines like sea urchins, shells. You can see over on the right bottom, there's a little filefish that looks like the sargassum it's hiding in. So there's a ton of different prey strategies to avoid predation. And of course, for every prey item that avoids predation, predators have to up their game. Predators can adapt to be fast, agile, camouflage. They can have large teeth. They can have poison. They can even hunt in packs. On the far left, you'll see a scorpionfish, which is a lion-weight predator. It basically camouflages itself like the rock, and when little fish swim by, it can gulp them up. The white shark obviously has to compete with the speed and agility of sea lions, and it does that by surprise ambush attacks, things like that. The cone snail is a snail, a little mollusk that has a venom in it, and it can actually kill other fish as well as other invertebrates, which is really kind of interesting. So all of these animals have been adapting to essentially access those prey items. Now, predator-prey relationships help keep a healthy balance of populations within an ecosystem. For an example, if you look at the kelp forests off the coast of California, these are the large stalks of algae that kind of create a big forest, right? Now, sea stars, specifically something called Pycnopodia, helps to keep the number of mussels, sea urchins, and shellfish down that would otherwise consume and or destroy the kelp forest itself, and thus the entire community. Now, sea otters are also involved in this little play as well, but this is just an example looking at the sea star Pycnopodia and its relationship to the whole community. So now let's bring all of these concepts together and talk about something you've probably heard of before, and that is a food chain. Food chains represent one pathway that energy flows from a given producer and each of the following consumers. So for example, you have over here on the right, the sun at the very bottom, that's starting things off. Then you have producers, which would be your phytoplankton, your primary consumers, which would eat the phytoplankton, the example being copepods. You'll learn about those later. And then a secondary consumer, which would be the ocean sunfish, a tertiary consumer, a small shark, and then a larger shark as a quaternary consumer. Now you probably realize that most animals don't eat just one thing, right? You don't eat just one thing. And that's true for a lot of species. And thus a food chain is useful, but it's not 100% representative. This is why we have something called a food web, which represents a summary of all the different feeding relationships in an ecosystem. And in the food web, the arrows show movement of energy and biomass and nutrients throughout the system. So you can see a large kind of food web here represented in the graphic. And the food chain we first looked at is lifted from this larger food web. So that's how it works. Now, an apex predator is an organism at the end of a food chain which has no natural predators. An example would probably be the great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias. Killer whale or Sinosauria would be another example that you put up there as well. Of course, just remember, even apex predators get decomposed, so nobody avoids that eventually. Now we can talk about trophic structure, and we'll start with a trophic level, which is the position an organism occupies in the food chain or food web. Tropho is Latin for food, essentially. Now, you've probably seen a pyramid before with different levels, and you have your producers at the bottom and so on and so forth. This is similar in idea. Your first trophic level is going to be representative of your producers. That's anything that's photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, right? Then you have your trophic level 2, which would be your herbivores and primary consumers. Then you have trophic level 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on how many you have in whichever ecosystem. And they are all carnivorous consumers, that kind of a thing, right? And you can see the representative over on the left, right? You have trophic level 1 with phytoplankton and zooplankton as 2, so on and so forth, all the way up. Now, there are interrelationships between the levels. Essentially, think of it this way. Organisms can occupy more than one trophic level. Organisms might feed on one thing, or they might feed on multiple food sources, and that puts them feeding in different trophic levels. And of course, vice versa, something could eat you from different trophic levels as well. And essentially, the number of organisms of each species in a food web are interrelated. If you have a higher population of one thing or another thing, that's going to affect each other. Especially when you're talking about food sources and who has access to which food source and how many of each species is accessing that one food source, that kind of a thing. So these are all interrelated ideas, and you will have to think about that as you're given problems during various different tests and questions and things like that. So just keep that in mind, and we'll have practice on this later. And that is it for today. So remember that main idea. Feeding relationships help define food webs as energy and biomass is transferred from one trophic level to the next. And until next time, keep learning.